The soft, golden-pink fingers of early dawn were just beginning to stretch across the sprawling, waking cityscape of Owerri, Nigeria. The night had been restless, humid, and for one particular man, interminably long, filled with the buzzing ghosts of a 12-year absence that seemed to have evaporated into thin air the moment his plane touched down. Now, as the morning sun began to bathe the luxurious facade of a five-star hotel in its gentle light, a formidable jet-black luxury SUV, its chrome accents gleaming like fallen stars under the nascent daylight, stood waiting patiently, almost reverently, by the main entrance. A chauffeur, impeccably dressed and standing at attention, cast nervous glances toward the ornate lobby doors, fully aware of the importance of this morning's mission. Inside one of the hotel's opulent suites, the atmosphere was thick with silence, tension, and the heavy scent of premium coffee that hadn't been touched. Mr. Okon, a figure whose presence alone seemed to command respect and radiate success, sat on the very edge of his expansive king-sized bed. He was not a young man anymore, the lines on his handsome dark face hinting at years of relentless ambition, countless sleepless nights, and the crushing pressures of building a business empire from absolute nothingness. But his eyes still held that fierce, penetrating light that had driven him across oceans. He was silent, the ticking of his expensive watch the only sound filling the room, echoing the rapid beat of his heart. 12 years. 12 years. That was the length of time he had been away from this country. His home, his very blood. He had left as a young man full of wild dreams and the burning desire to escape the suffocating grip of poverty, carrying only a single weathered suitcase and the whispered promises of a brighter future in a foreign land. He had left behind everything he knew, everything he loved, driven by the belief that he had to go away to truly become someone, and now he was back. But he was not that same struggling young man, burdened by the fear of failure and the uncertainty of tomorrow. No. He was now Okon, the legendary CEO, a magnate of industry, a man whose name was whispered with awe in boardrooms across continents, whose wealth was almost impossible to comprehend, and whose power was undeniable. Yet as he looked at the intricate details of his luxury suite, a wave of profound emptiness washed over him. All of this, the money, the cars, the accolades, the influence, it meant nothing, absolutely nothing, without the people who had inspired him to chase those dreams in the first place. He slowly looked down at his watch, a masterful piece of engineering, the hands seeming to drag as if to torment him. Today was the day he had been planning, dreaming of, and fearing, all in the same breath. Today, I will finally go home and visit my mother, he whispered to himself, his voice a low, emotional rumble that seemed to vibrate through the silent room. He had intended, truly, desperately intended, to make the journey to the village the previous night, immediately after landing, to burst through that familiar doorway and feel her embrace. But his flight had arrived agonizingly late, delayed by unpredictable weather and endless bureaucracy, and his advisors, ever cautious, had convinced him to wait until morning, citing safety and logistics. And so he had waited, a prisoner of luxury, pacing the floor of this lavish room until the first light of dawn offered its permission to proceed. He slowly stood up, the rich fabric of his shirt rustling, and made his way to the window, gazing out at the waking city that had changed so much in his absence. It was time. He grabbed his coat, gave one last look at his reflection. The face of a wealthy man, yes, but also a son who was coming home. And then, a few minutes later, he walked down the carpeted hallway and exited the hotel. Outside, the chauffeur was already waiting by the door, having sensed his approach. The SUV was immaculate, its black paint polished to such a mirror finish it almost seemed to absorb the light, gleaming under the first rays of the morning sun. The driver, a respectful man, opened the passenger door with a deferential flourish. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and professionalism. Mr. Okon merely nodded, a gesture that was both polite and distant, and slipped into the plush, leather-bound interior of the vehicle, the scent of expensive upholstery welcoming him. "Let's go," he said, and the driver softly closed the door and got into his seat. The SUV merged flawlessly into the busy Owerri road, navigating the flow of early morning traffic with an ease that only a luxury vehicle could command. But as the car moved through the streets, navigating roundabouts and bypassing smaller vehicles, Mr. Okon was not present in the city he was driving through. He was far, far away, his gaze fixed on the roadside, but his mind traversing vast distances of time and memory. He was thinking of the small mud-walled house he had grown up in, with its leaky roof and dirt floor, where laughter and poverty lived side by side. He remembered his mother, Mrs. Madara, a woman of indomitable strength and unwavering love, whose eyes, even in the bleakest times, always held a light of hope. He remembered her hands, calloused from endless work, always finding a way to soothe his hurts and tend to his needs. And he remembered his younger sister, Cheetah, the joyful child who was his shadow, whose laughter was the soundtrack to his childhood. Before he left, all those years ago, life had been unimaginably hard, a daily struggle for survival, but even in the midst of their suffering, he had always held on to one sacred promise that he had made to them, a vow that had become his anchor. "I will not forget both of you," he had said to them, holding their hands tightly, tears streaming down his face as he stood on the precipice of his departure. "I will take care of you. I will come back for you." And in his mind, he believed he had done just that. He knew it wasn't easy, not from the beginning, not at all. For the first agonizing 3 years abroad, Okon had struggled, truly struggled, working endless, back-breaking hours in demanding jobs just to survive in a strange and often hostile land, facing rejection and despair at every turn. There were days, painful, bleak days, when he had almost nothing left after paying his meager rent and feeding himself. When the dream of wealth seemed a cruel and distant joke. He had eaten stale bread and drank water, living in squalor while nursing his ambitions. But he had never given up. He could not give up, not with their faces etched in his mind, not with that promise burning in his heart. And then, finally, things began to change for him, slowly at first, but with growing momentum. His hard work and dedication were noticed. Better opportunities arose. Doors began to open that he hadn't even known existed, and the life he had so desperately craved began to reveal itself to him. He was a smart man, and he seized those opportunities with both hands, building a small business that grew into an empire. That was when he had started sending money home. Month after month, year after year, for about 8 to 9 years now, he had never missed a single payment. It was a substantial amount, far more than enough to live a life of comfort and security, and he had entrusted it, every kobo, to his sister Cheetah, to be given to their mother for her every need, and to ensure she wanted for nothing. His mother, an elderly woman rooted in tradition and simple living, did not understand modern banking or complex technology. She barely knew how modern devices worked, much less how to access international funds, so Okon, assuming it was the right and responsible thing to do, had always communicated and routed his support through his younger sister. For a while, things seemed to be going well, their conversations filled with updates and expressions of gratitude. But then, some years ago, everything had begun to change. A shift so subtle that he hadn't fully recognized its significance until much later. Cheetah had gotten married and left the family home, moving to another town with her husband, no longer staying with their mother to manage her daily affairs. From that moment, it became increasingly harder for Okon to reach his mother directly, the lines of communication with her becoming frayed and eventually broken. At some point, he had stopped hearing her actual voice completely, his sister becoming the sole gatekeeper and interpreter of their mother's life. Each time he called, with a growing knot of worry in his stomach, asking to speak with her or inquiring about her health, his sister would always find a convenient and believable excuse. "Ah, brother, don't worry, mother is fine. I just visited her not long ago, and she is doing excellently. She also sends her regards and is always praying for you." Sometimes Okon would even ask her directly, almost pleadingly, "Please, Cheetah, whenever you go to see her, just call me from her house, right then, so I can speak with her myself, even for just a minute." But his sister, ever resourceful, would always find a way out of it. "Ah, the network there is very bad, brother. My phone has no signal at all when I am in that area. Sometimes the calls just won't connect. It's a real problem, I tell you. I've even tried to call you myself while I was there, but it never goes through. So what can I do but wait until I return to my own house?" Just like that, Okon, separated by thousands of miles and blinded by love and a desperate need to believe his family was safe, would have no choice but to believe her. He believed they were all doing well, living in a house he had sent money to build, comfortable, secure, and happy, far from the clutches of the poverty they had once known, all because he had been sending them money, a significant fortune. Month after month after month, that deep-seated, comforting belief had stayed in his heart, a protective shield against the harsh realities, all the way until this very morning. As the SUV drove through the busy streets, the chauffeur navigating traffic with professional calm, Okon's eyes, accustomed to the luxury and order of other places, were moving slowly and observational across the roadside, taking in the sights and sounds of the city of his youth. But then, as they approached a congested intersection known for its street vendors and pedestrians, he saw something that made him sit up straight in his seat, his heart giving a sudden, violent jolt. At first, he was not sure. He had seen countless faces begging for help on the streets of the city, a harsh reflection of the social inequality that existed. But this particular face, he looked again, straining his eyes as the car got closer, a powerful sense of unease washing over him. An elderly woman was sitting close to the roadside, hunched over, seemingly small and incredibly tired. Her clothes were nothing but a collection of old, faded, and worn-out rags that clung to her frail frame. She was holding a small, chipped bowl in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the pavement, occasionally raising her head to silently ask for help from passers-by. Okon's heart, moments ago filled with the warmth of a homecoming, slows its beat, the air in the luxurious SUV suddenly feeling suffocating. He leaned closer to the window, the chauffeur, aware of his passenger's sudden tension, beginning to slow down slightly. As the car got nearer, he strained his eyes, trying hard to see the woman more clearly, a cold, icy dread beginning to creep into his soul. No, no, it was a silent whisper, a denial that choked him before it could form on his lips. But as the gap closed, the evidence became irrefutable. That face, he said, under his breath, the words a terrified rumble, because even after 12 long years, even through the ravages of age, poverty, and unimaginable suffering, he recognized that face. He knew every line, every expression, every detail of the person who had given him life and had loved him with an unwavering force. He knew it, and he denied it with every fiber of his being. He quickly tapped the back of the driver's seat, the simple action filled with a manic energy. "Stop the car," he said, his voice no longer a controlled request, but a sharp, hysterical command. The driver, startled by the urgency and the raw emotion in his boss's voice, slowed down at once and pulled over the luxurious SUV, coming to a halt just a few feet from the woman. Okon did not wait. He opened the passenger door, not caring about the traffic or the stares of onlookers, and stepped out fast, the noise of the busy road fading in his ears, replaced only by the thudding of his own heart. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman, a figure that was rapidly transforming from a street beggar into his very mother. He was a giant of a man, a wealthy CEO, a figure of power, and yet in that moment as he walked closer, step by agonizing step, he felt like a child again, a child whose world was falling apart. He approached her slowly, a powerful aura of disbelief and profound pain radiating from him. He stopped just inches away from her, the reality of the situation crashing down on him with the force of a tsunami. His face went perfectly still, the expression of a man who has just seen the unthinkable. It was her. It was really her, Mrs. Madara, his mother, the woman who had promised him a better life. She sat there on the cold, dirty pavement, weak, almost skeletal, holding the chipped bowl close to her chest like a prized possession. Her clothes, if they could even be called that, were so old and worn out they were practically disintegrating. Her body, her frail, trembling body, looked like it had not known a proper meal in many years, the toll of extreme poverty etched onto her skin. Okon's mouth opened, a soundless scream of agony echoing in his mind, but no words came out at first. How could this be? How could his mother be here, on the street, begging for food, when he had sent a fortune to ensure she would never know hunger again? Then he finally found his voice, a low, choked whisper that barely escaped his throat. "Mother," he said, and the woman lifted her head, her tired eyes meeting his in a moment that felt like an eternity. For a long, silent moment she did not move, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, staring at the face of a man she had not seen in 12 years, the face of a son she had prayed for every single day. And then her hands shook, the chipped bowl almost clattering to the pavement. "Okon," she said, her voice a low, tremulous rumble that seemed to hold all the suffering and sorrow of the past 12 years. A single tear escaped her eye, and then another, and then a torrent of emotions overwhelmed her. Tears filled her eyes completely, blurring her vision as she tried to stand, to reach out to the son who had finally come back, but her legs, weakened by years of malnutrition and age, could not hold her well and she began to stumble. Okon, seeing her struggle, quickly rushed forward, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces with each moment. He reached out and held her gently but firmly, preventing her from falling. "Don't stand. Please don't stand yet," he said, his voice thick with tears, a mix of panic and profound love. He looked around, his mind spinning, confused and utterly upset, his gaze darting back and forth from her condition to the street. Why are you here? What happened to the money? What happened to the house? Cheetah, Cheetah said you were doing fine. Why are you in this state, Mrs.? Madara tried to speak, her mouth opening but her voice, weakened by starvation and exhaustion, was a barely audible whisper. Before she could even finish, Okon gently helped her up, his powerful arms supporting her frail form with such careful precision. Come with me, he said, and the tone of his voice was no longer that of a businessman, but a son, a protector, a man whose love was a blazing fire. He guided her carefully back to the luxurious SUV, a vehicle that now felt absurdly inappropriate and yet necessary for her rescue. The people on the road, the vendors and pedestrians, watched the entire scene quietly, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and a strange respect. A man who appeared to be from the upper class, helping a street beggar, a woman known by many with such profound emotion, it was a sight not seen every day. Okon helped his mother into the plush, leather-bound back seat of the car and sat down beside her, his body acting as a shield between her and the world that had abandoned her. She was still trembling violently, tears streaming down her face, a complex storm of shock, relief, and profound sorrow at seeing the son she had missed with all her heart. Okon looked at the chauffeur, his eyes hard, his decision made. Turn around, he said, his voice low and firm, a command that brooked no discussion. Take us to the nearest hospital. The driver, witnessing the entire scene and recognizing the depth of the situation, did not ask any questions, did not offer any hesitation. He immediately began the slow process of turning the large SUV around in the congested street, navigating with expert skill to head in the opposite direction. As the vehicle pulled back into the flow of traffic, Okon held his mother's trembling hand tightly in his own, her skin thin and papery, the very presence of her a testament to her suffering. The luxurious SUV, a symbol of his hard-earned success, moved through the city streets, a cocoon of luxury in a world of poverty. But in his mind, in the deep, dark spaces of his thoughts, only one agonizing question kept repeating itself, a haunting melody that was tearing him apart from the inside. If I have been sending money all these years, for the house, for her upkeep, for everything, if I never missed a single payment, then tell me, why? Why is my mother, my own mother, the woman who loved me and sacrificed everything for me, begging on the street for food? What happened? Who did this? The question hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying, as the SUV raced toward the hospital, carrying with it a profound mystery and a promise of reckoning. The clinical, sterilized air of the hospital waiting room was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of the Owerri morning outside. Mr. Okon paced the polished linoleum floor like a caged predator, his expensive leather shoes clicking with a sharp, rhythmic urgency that echoed off the white walls. Each second that ticked by on his wristwatch felt like an eternity, a slow drip of psychological torture as he waited for some word, any word, regarding his mother's condition. His mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions, profound grief over the broken state in which he had found her, and a burning, white-hot rage that was slowly centering itself around one specific name, Cheetah. He looked down at his phone, his thumb hovering over his sister's contact information. He had tried calling her multiple times since arriving at the hospital, his calls ringing out into an empty, mocking silence before being pushed straight to voicemail. Why wasn't she answering? If she truly believed their mother was safe and living in a newly built modern home, why was she suddenly unreachable the moment he landed in the country? The silence from her end was deafening, and with each missed call, the terrifying puzzle pieces of the last 9 years were beginning to reshape into a picture of monstrous betrayal. The heavy double doors of the emergency ward finally swung open, and a middle-aged doctor stepped out into the reception area, holding a clipboard. Okon intercepted him instantly, his commanding presence demanding immediate attention. Are you the one who brought in the elderly woman from the roadside? The doctor asked, his voice carrying a heavy tone of professional concern. Yes, doctor. She is my mother, Okon replied, his voice strained, desperate for reassurance. The doctor looked at the well-dressed, wealthy man before him, then down at his charts, a look of profound confusion and subtle judgment passing over his face. Physically, there is no acute, life-threatening illness, the doctor began slowly. However, her body is severely compromised. She is suffering from advanced, prolonged malnutrition and extreme physical exhaustion. It looks as though she has not had access to proper, consistent meals or clean water for several years. Her immune system is practically non-existent, and her joints are worn down from what appears to be hours of sitting on hard concrete surfaces. We need to admit her immediately, place her on an intravenous drip to restore her fluids and nutrients, and keep her under strict observation until tomorrow morning." Every word from the doctor's mouth felt like a physical blow to Okon's chest. Malnutrition? Years without consistent meals? He had been sending hundreds of thousands of naira every single month, a sum that could have easily fed an entire village, let alone one elderly woman. "Please, go ahead with whatever treatment she needs," Okon said quickly, his voice cracking with emotion. "Money is not an issue. Give her the best private suite, the best medication, everything." The doctor gave a slight, formal nod, his demeanor softening slightly as he realized the man before him was genuinely devastated. "All right, we will begin the aggressive rehydration and nutrition therapy immediately." Not long after, Mrs. Madara was moved into a quiet private ward, and the medical staff started her treatment, hooking her fragile, bruised arms up to IV drips. Okon remained in the waiting area for several more minutes, his eyes fixed on the hallway where they had taken her, his hands clenched into tight fists. He felt a wave of profound guilt washing over him. He had trusted his sister blindly. He had allowed himself to be pacified by convenient excuses about poor network reception and busy schedules, all while his mother was slowly wasting away on the dusty streets, begging strangers for crumbs. When the doctor passed by the waiting room again, Okon stood up at once, blocking his path. "Doctor, please, how is she responding?" he asked, his heart in his throat. The doctor gave a calm, reassuring look, placing a hand briefly on Okon's shoulder. "Don't worry, she is a resilient woman. She is sleeping now, and the fluids are already helping to stabilize her vitals. She will be fine, but she needs absolute quiet." Okon let out a quiet, trembling breath, the first real breath he had taken since stepping out of his luxury car. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice thick. "Can I go in and see her?" "Of course you can go in now, but please do not wake her," the doctor replied before walking away down the corridor. Okon walked into the dim ward, the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound breaking the silence. He approached the bed slowly, his breath catching in his throat. His mother lay there, looking so incredibly small beneath the white, hospital blankets. Her face, even in sleep, bore the deep, etched lines of years of unyielding sorrow and hardship. She looked impossibly weak, her breathing shallow but steady. Okon stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, remembering the vibrant, strong woman who had raised him. The injustice of it all threatened to suffocate him. Why? Why would Cheetah do this? What could possibly possess a daughter to leave her own flesh and blood to starve while collecting thousands of dollars every month? This was a test of loyalty that Cheetah had not just failed, she had completely obliterated it. Okon quietly stepped back, pulling a chair close to the bedsides, and sat down, refusing to leave her side. He brought out his phone once more, dialing Cheetah's number with a trembling finger. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the room. It rang and rang, a torturous sound, until it cut off. He tried again immediately, his jaw tightening so hard his teeth ached. Still no answer. Okon stared at the glowing screen in the dark room, a cold certainty settling into his mind. "I already told her last week that I was coming back to the country around this date," he whispered quietly to himself, his voice shaking with a terrifying blend of sadness and anger. "She knows I am here. She knows my flight arrived. Is that why she is suddenly hiding? Is that why she is refusing to pick up my calls?" He leaned back in the chair, his eyes returning to the fragile form of his mother sleeping peacefully under the medical drip. His face was a mask of pure agony and confusion. How had their family dynamic devolved into this monstrous betrayal? Why would his own sister, the girl he had protected and loved, commit such an act of cruelty? The room remained quiet, the steady, mechanical beep of the monitor acting as a solemn witness to a son's growing resolve for justice. The next morning, the harsh white light of the sun began to filter through the window blinds, casting long shadows across the hospital ward. Mrs. Madara stirred, her eyelids fluttering open slowly as she woke from the first deep, comfortable sleep she had experienced in a decade. She blinked against the morning light, looking around the unfamiliar room, confused by the clean sheets, the humming machines, and the softness beneath her. Then she turned her head slowly toward the side of the bed. Her eyes fell on the figure sitting in the chair beside her. She blinked again, rubbing her eyes with a weak, trembling hand, unsure if her mind was playing cruel tricks on her. It was Okon. It was really him. He was leaning forward, his head resting in his hands, having fallen asleep in the uncomfortable chair after a night of vigilant watching. For several minutes, she did not say a word. She just stared at him, her chest heaving with an overwhelming surge of emotion, her heart overflowing with a mother's pure, unfiltered love. The boy who had left 12 years ago had returned as a protector. She slowly sat up, her bones aching but her spirit renewed, and called out to him, her voice a soft, fragile whisper that shattered the silence of the room. Okon. Okon shifted slightly at the sound of his name, his eyes snapping open instantly. He looked up, his gaze immediately locking onto his mother's face. "Mother, you are awake," he said, moving closer to the bed, his voice filled with an intense protective warmth. "Mrs." Madara reached out her frail, trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his cheek, tracing this line of his jaw, as if to convince herself that he was flesh and blood, not a ghost birthed from her desperation. "My son, is it really you?" she said, her voice shaking violently as a new wave of tears filled her eyes. "Or am I just dreaming? Have I finally lost my mind on that road?" Okon caught her hand, pressing it against his face, his own eyes welling with tears. "It's me, mother," he said gently, kissing her palm. "It is really me. I am here now, and I promise you, I am not going anywhere, not anymore. No one will ever hurt you again, Mrs." Madara shook her head slowly, the tears rolling freely down her wrinkled cheeks, holding his hand as if it were a lifeline. "My son, my beautiful son." At that exact moment, the door opened and the doctor walked into the room, a warm smile on his face as he observed the emotional reunion. "Good morning," the doctor said cheerfully. Okon stood up quickly, wiping his eyes and regaining his professional composure. "Good morning, doctor." The doctor approached the bed, checking the monitors and examining Mrs. Madara's vitals with a satisfied nod. "You are doing remarkably well, Ma," he said, turning to her with a smile. "The fluids have worked wonders. Your vitals are completely stable, and you are fit to be discharged. You can go home today." Mrs. Madara gave a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for saving an old woman," she said softly. "You are very welcome," the doctor replied, turning to Okon to finalize the paperwork. Later, that morning, after the extensive hospital bills were settled without a second thought, they left the building. Okon helped his mother into the plush, luxurious interior of the black SUV, ensuring she was completely comfortable. However, instead of driving toward the village or the address Cheetah had previously given him, Okon instructed the driver to take them to a quiet, high-end restaurant in a peaceful district of town. He needed to get her into a safe, neutral space, and more importantly, he needed answers. They arrived at the restaurant, an upscale, serene establishment, where soft classical music played in the background, and the ambient noise of the city was completely shut out. They sat down at a secluded table in the corner, and within minutes a feast of rich, traditional, and easily digestible food was placed before them. Mrs. Madara stared at the abundance of food for a long, silent moment, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and deep-seated sadness. She looked at the steaming bowls of soup, the fresh fish, the pounded yam, and then looked at her hands. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to eat. At first her movements were incredibly slow, almost as if she expected someone to snatch the plate away from her, but as the taste of proper nourishment hit her tongue, she began to eat a bit faster, her hunger revealing just how long she had been deprived of a real meal. Okon watched her silently, his heart incredibly heavy, a lump forming in his throat that made it impossible for him to touch his own food. The sheer injustice of watching his mother eat like a starving refugee, while his bank accounts held millions, was a knife twisting in his soul. After a while, having satisfied her immediate hunger, Mrs. Madara paused and looked up at her son. A look of deep confusion and concern settled over her face. "My son," she said softly, her voice carrying a heavy weight, "how are you able to afford all of this? How are you able to take care of yourself over there in the foreign land, let alone pay for this expensive hospital and this food?" Okon looked at her, completely taken aback by the question, his brow furrowing in utter pride. Before he could answer, she continued, her voice filled with a mother's worry. "How did you even manage to raise the money to come back home?" Cheetah told me that things were terribly bad for you over there. She told me you were stranded, sleeping on the streets, completely broke and unable to find work." Okon's hand froze midair, his entire body going rigid as her words echoed in his ears. "What?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, slow whisper. Mrs. Madara nodded slowly, her eyes innocent, completely unaware of the bomb she had just dropped. "Yes, my son. She told me that the foreign country had swallowed you up, that things had become an absolute nightmare for you. She said that is why I have not received a single kobo or any form of money from you for about 3 years now." She paused for a moment, looking down at her plate, her voice dropping even softer as she recalled her desperation. And because of my advanced age and failing health, I could no longer continue my small market business. I had no money for food, no money for rent, nothing. Okon's eyes widened in absolute horror, his mind spinning out of control as the sheer scale of the deception began to dawn on him. For 3 years, she told you I was stranded? He repeated, his voice tight, fighting to maintain control. Yes, his mother replied softly. She said you were suffering deeply and that we had to pray for you. After your sister got married and left the family house to live with her husband, she stopped coming around often, and then the landlord evicted me because the rent hadn't been paid, and things became completely impossible for me. I had no choice but to go to the roadside to beg, just to stay alive, while crying out to God to save my stranded son. Okon leaned back in his chair, the world around him seemingly fading into a dull roar as his mind raced at lightning speed. The sheer, calculated malice of his sister's lie was breathtaking. Mama, Okon said, his voice terrifyingly low but incredibly firm, I have been sending money every single month, millions of naira. For 9 years, I never missed a single month, not even once. I sent money for your food, for your clothes, for your medical care, and for a massive, modern house. Mrs. Madara looked at him, her eyes clouded with intense confusion, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between Cheetah's words and Okon's reality. My son, it has been a long, painful while since anything, even a single coin, reached my hands. Cheetah told me you were a beggar abroad. Okon shook his head, a cold, ruthless anger taking root in the center of his chest. I called Cheetah many times every single month, Mama, especially each time I made the bank transfer for your monthly upkeep, and each time without fail. She told me that you were living in absolute comfort, that you were happy, and that you sent your love. She told me the network in your area was too bad for me to call you directly. They both went completely quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence, settling over the restaurant table as the monstrous truth finally settled between them. It was a slow, agonizing realization. Okon looked away, staring out the window, but his eyes saw nothing but the memories of his sister's deceitful voice over the telephone. Now every single detail made perfect, horrible sense. The missed calls, the endless, recycled excuses about bad signals, the structural barriers she put up to keep him away from their mother, the repeated reassuring script. Don't worry, mother is fine. It was all a calculated, cold-blooded lie designed to fund her own life while leaving their mother to die on the streets. Mrs. Madara slowly held her chest, her breathing becoming shallow as the reality of her daughter's betrayal pierced her heart. You mean, Cheetah took everything? She started, but the words choked in her throat, unable to completely process that the child she had loved and nurtured could be capable of such profound cruelty. Okon nodded slowly, his face turning into stone. Neither of them wanted to vocalize the horrific depth of the betrayal, but the truth was undeniable. Cheetah had been systematically robbing them both, exploiting her brother's generosity and left her mother to starve in absolute poverty. After some time, the silence became unbearable, and Okon stood up slowly, his resolve hardening into an unyielding force. Mama, let's go, he said gently, his voice soft for his mother but holding a dangerous undercurrent. He helped his mother up from the table, guiding her back to the waiting luxury car. But before returning to the hotel or making any final decisions, Okon instructed the driver to stop at an exclusive, high-end clothing boutique where luxury, ready-made traditional, and modern attire was sold. He led his mother inside the pristine, brightly lit shop. Mrs. Madara looked around at the expensive, elegant fabrics, the golden mannequins, and the wealthy clientele, immediately shrinking back, looking down at her worn slippers. She turned to her son, whispering anxiously, My son, are you sure about this? These clothes, they look far too expensive for an old woman like me. We should not waste your money. Okon looked down at her, a wave of intense love and sorrow washing over him, and smiled warmly, wrapping an arm around her frail shoulders. Mama, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his immense wealth and devotion, I am back now. I am here to take care of you myself, and I promise you, nothing in this entire world is too expensive for my mother. You will never wear rags again. For the first time in many long, grueling years, a genuine, beautiful smile broke across Mrs. Madara's tired face, lighting up her eyes. Slowly, with the assistance of the deferential shop attendants who recognized Okon's high social status, she began to choose a few simple but incredibly beautiful, high-quality dresses, picking each one with careful, childlike wonder. Okon paid for everything with a swipe of his card, the amount completely insignificant to him, and the attendants packed the luxury garments into elegant designer bags. As they left the boutique and settled back into the comfortable leather seats of the SUV, the atmosphere in the car shifted once again to a heavy, investigative focus. Okon leaned back, his mind working through the timeline of Cheetah's massive fraud. He turned to his mother, his voice quiet but sharp. "Mama, did you say you have not seen Cheetah for over 3 years?" he asked, needing to confirm every timeline. Mrs. Madara let out a deep, ragged sigh, her voice dropping into a register of profound maternal sadness. "My son, I don't know what happened to your younger sister. She completely changed after her marriage to that man. She became distant, cold." She paused, shaking her head in gentle disbelief. "She has not come to see me, not even once, for more than 3 years now. I was completely isolated. They even moved out of their former rented house suddenly, and she never told me where they went. It was only when my situation became desperate, and I used the last of my energy to walk to their old neighborhood to check on them, that the neighbors told me they had already left the area months ago without leaving a forwarding address." Okon's brows tightened into a fierce, dangerous glare, his jaw locking tightly. He murmured under his breath, his mind cataloging this vital piece of information. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping an octave, revealing a piece of the puzzle that made the crime infinitely worse. "The reason I am asking all these detailed questions, Mama, is because 2 years ago, Cheetah requested a massive sum of money from me. She told me she was supervising the construction of a modern, multi-bedroom bungalow for you. I sent her millions of naira to purchase a prime plot of land and separate monthly installments to build and complete the house so you could move out of the old family home." Mrs. Madara turned to look at him, her jaw dropping in utter, absolute bewilderment. "A house? Built for me?" she whispered, her mind unable to comprehend the scale of the wealth involved. Okon brought out his flagship smartphone, unlocking it quickly and opening his digital gallery. He began scrolling through a dedicated folder, his face grim. "Look at this, Mama," he said, holding the screen in front of her. "These are the weekly progress pictures she was sending to me via chat." He showed her image after image, detailed photographs showing the excavation of the foundation, the rising brick walls, the complex wooden framework for the roofing, until finally showing pictures of a fully completed, beautifully painted, and landscaped modern bungalow. Mrs. Madara stared at the glowing screen, her old eyes wide with complete shock as she looked at the beautiful home that supposedly belonged to her. This house," she whispered, her voice trembling. Okon swallowed hard, the betrayal tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was actually on my way to that exact location yesterday morning when our car pulled over and I saw you on the roadside," he said, his voice cracking with emotional intensity. "I genuinely believed, in my heart, that you were already living inside this beautiful home, surrounded by luxury and peace." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the interior of the luxury car as the ultimate realization sank in. Then suddenly, something inside Mrs. Madara completely broke, and she dissolved into a fit of violent, heartbroken tears, her entire frame shaking as she covered her face with her hands. "What happened to my daughter?" she cried out, her voice filled with an agonizing, maternal grief that echoed through the vehicle. "How did the little girl I carried in my womb for 9 months, the child I suffered for, become so incredibly heartless and cruel toward her own mother? How can someone possess such a wicked soul?" Her voice shook deeply, her tears soaking through her newly purchased dress. "All these years, all these long, painful years on the streets, I believed you were the one who was suffering abroad. I thought you were stranded and starved, and every single night on my cold mat, I was crying out to God, begging Him to open the windows of heaven and bless my children, to save you from poverty." Tears rolled freely down her face as she shook her head in pure agony. I did not know that God had already answered my prayers years ago. I did not know that my own son was a wealthy man and that my daughter was stealing my life." Okon moved closer, wrapping his powerful arms around her, holding her gently as she sobbed against his chest. "Mama, it's okay. Please, it's all over now," he said softly, his voice a soothing balm, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth, staring coldly into the distance. "I am here now. No one will ever deceive us again." He held her trembling hand firmly, his mind locking onto a definitive target. "We are going to that exact location right now, Mama. I want to see with my own eyes what she did with the land and the house I sent her a fortune to build for you. We need to see the truth." The luxurious SUV surged forward again, changing direction and heading toward the developing outskirts of Owerri, following the precise digital coordinates Cheetah had sent him 2 years ago. They drove for a long, quiet time, almost 2 full hours, leaving the busy city center behind and entering an area characterized by scattered construction projects and empty plots of land. Finally, the driver slowed the vehicle down, checking the navigation system before pulling over to the side of an unpaved road. "We have arrived at the destination coordinates, sir," the driver announced quietly. Okon stepped out of the car into the hot afternoon sun, the dust swirling around his expensive shoes. He turned back to the open door, looking at his emotionally exhausted mother. "Mama, please stay inside where the air conditioning is running," he said gently. "Let me inspect the area first." She nodded weakly, her eyes filled with an infinite sadness. Okon closed the door and turned around slowly, his sharp eyes searching the immediate surroundings, his face transforming into a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. He took a few slow, deliberate steps forward, then stopped dead in his tracks. "This place," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with a terrifying calm. He looked at the coordinates on his phone, then looked at the plot of land before him, then looked back at the photos Cheetah had sent. His heart began to beat with a wild, frantic rhythm. "Is this not the exact land Cheetah claimed to have bought for me?" he said quietly to himself. But as he looked across the perimeter, there was absolutely nothing there. There was no modern bungalow. There were no concrete walls, no foundation stones, no bags of cement, no signs of human labor or construction whatsoever. There was only a vast, empty, and completely abandoned plot of land, completely overgrown with tall, wild elephant grasses and tangled weeds that had clearly been growing undisturbed for years. Okon walked a little further down the dirt street, checking the neighboring houses and prominent landmarks against the background of the photos Cheetah had sent him. Everything in the surrounding area matched perfectly. The electric poles, the neighbor's unique green roof in the distance. Everything was identical. This was, without a shadow of a doubt, the exact location. His sister had literally stood in front of an empty, overgrown field, taken photos of a completely different construction site somewhere else, or digitally manipulated the images to create a flawless, multi-million naira illusion of a house that never existed. She had stolen every single dime meant for the building, leaving the land as a barren monument to her greed. Okon slowly brought out his phone once again, his fingers steady now, fueled by a cold, calculating resolve. He dialed Cheetah's number for the final time. It began to ring, once, twice, 3 times. Then, just like before, it disconnected, going straight to a cold voicemail recording. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his face rippled. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the empty, weed-choked field for a long, silent moment, the hot wind blowing against his suit, before turning around and walking back to the luxury SUV with slow, deliberate steps. He opened the car door and sat down heavily beside his mother, letting out a deep, ragged sigh that carried the weight of an impending storm. "Mama," he said slowly, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or emotion, "I don't even know what to think right now. The betrayal goes deeper than we ever imagined." She looked at him with wide, worried, and tear-stained eyes, sensing the dark energy radiating from him. "The land is completely empty, Mama," he said, delivering the final, crushing truth. "There is absolutely nothing there. No house, no foundation, nothing but wild grass and dirt." She lied about everything, Mrs. Madara instantly covered her mouth with both hands, a choked, agonizing sob escaping her throat as a fresh torrent of tears rushed down her face. "My God, my own child," she cried out softly, her spirit completely crushed by the realization that her daughter had entirely erased her existence for money. Okon gently held her trembling shoulders, pulling her close. "Mama, please, I beg of you, don't cry anymore," he said, his voice softening with intense protective care. "For the sake of your health, for your heart, I don't want your blood pressure to rise again. We just left the hospital, Net. Please, leave everything to me now." She nodded slowly, trying desperately to control her sobbing, wiping her tears with the edge of her new wrap. She murmured weakly, leaning against him as the car pulled away from the barren field. Okon leaned back in his seat, his eyes staring straight ahead, his brilliant business mind working at a frantic, clinical pace. He was no longer just a grieving son. He was a CEO executing a strategic operation. Right there in the back seat, he brought out his phone and began searching for a premium, high-security luxury service apartment complex in the most exclusive, peaceful corporate district of Owerri. Within minutes, using his corporate credentials, he secured a massive, fully furnished luxury apartment with 24-hour private security, a personal chef, and on-call medical assistance. Mama, you will not return to the village or any place where you can be found by anyone from the past, Okon said, his tone commanding and absolute. You will stay somewhere incredibly comfortable, somewhere safe, where you will be treated like the queen you are. The driver, understanding the unspoken directive, accelerated, navigating the SUV toward the exclusive residential district. When they arrived at the luxury apartment complex, Okon stepped out and carefully helped his mother inside, shielding her from the view of the street. The apartment was pristine, exceptionally quiet, beautifully arranged with plush furniture, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the soft afternoon light. Everything was already meticulously prepared for their arrival. A hot gourmet meal was waiting on the dining table. Clean silk sheets were laid out on an expansive bed. Running hot water was ready, and a peaceful, tranquil atmosphere enveloped the entire space. Okon turned to his mother, gently kissing her forehead. You will rest here, Mama, he said with an absolute, unshakable certainty. Everything you could ever need, want, or desire will be brought directly to your door. You are safe now, Mrs. Madara looked around the magnificent space, tears filling her eyes once again, but this time they were tears of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. My son, thank you, she whispered brokenly. Okon held her hand tightly, his face a calm mask of reassurance. I am here now, Mama. Your suffering is officially over. But as he closed the bedroom door, leaving her to rest in the care of the private staff, a dark, terrifying storm was completely building inside Okon's chest. His eyes turned into chips of ice. This was no mistake. This was not a financial mishap or a misunderstanding. Cheetah had systematically destroyed their mother's life for pure, unadulterated greed, and she had done it with a smile on her face. As Okon stood in the pristine living room of the luxury apartment, his mind locked onto a singular, burning objective. Cheetah had a massive, horrifying debt to pay, and he was going to ensure that karma collected every single cent, with interest. For the next 2 weeks, the luxurious penthouse suite where Okon resided became a silent, high-tech war room. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, the glow of multiple laptop screens illuminating his hardened, unforgiving features. As a team of private investigators and forensic accountants he had flown into Owerri delivered their initial findings. The depth of the financial fraud committed by his younger sister, Cheetah, was staggeringly complex, laid out in cold, unfeeling black and white spreadsheets. The records showed that every single wire transfer Okon had made over the past 9 years, money meant for their mother's premium medical care, her monthly living expenses, and the grand modern bungalow had been systematically diverted within minutes of hitting Cheetah's bank account. But what caught Okon's eye, making his jaw clench in pure disgust, was where the money had ultimately gone. Millions upon millions of naira had been channeled into establishing an incredibly lavish high-end event planning agency in a wealthy corporate sector of Owerri. Cheetah had used her mother's starvation as the literal foundation for her own societal ascension. She was currently living a life of absolute luxury, driving an expensive car, residing in a gated community, and rubbing shoulders with the city's elite, presenting herself as a self-made entrepreneur, while her own mother was begging for crumbs on a dusty pavement. Okon's investigators also uncovered that Cheetah had recently launched a massive public relations campaign to attract high-net-worth clients for her agency, branding herself as an emblem of modern success and sophistication. This piece of information was exactly what Okon needed. The trap was ready, and it was time to let the antagonist proudly walk into her own destruction. Meanwhile, miles away in her beautifully furnished corporate office, Cheetah sat comfortably in a plush leather chair, sipping imported wine and admiring her manicured nails. The walls of her office were adorned with photos of high-profile weddings and corporate galas she had managed, a testament to her seemingly thriving business. Her phone buzzed on the desk, showing a call from an unknown premium corporate number. She adjusted her designer blazer and answered with her most practiced professional voice. Good afternoon, this is Cheetah, CEO of Elite Events Management. How may we elevate your occasion today? On the other end of the line, a polished, authoritative male voiced, one of Okon's top executive assistants acting under strict orders, began to speak. Good afternoon, ma'am. I am calling on behalf of a major international corporate mogul who has recently arrived in Nigeria from the United States. my principal is looking to host an incredibly exclusive multi-million naira private gala to launch his new philanthropic foundation in Owerri. Money is absolutely no object for him, but he demands perfection. We have reviewed several agencies, and our local contacts assure us that you are the absolute best person for a high society job of this magnitude. Cheetah's eyes lit up with predatory greed, a wide, arrogant smile spreading across her face. A multi-million naira international gala was exactly the kind of high-profile contract that would solidify her status among the ultimate elite. I am deeply honored, Cheetah replied, her voice dripping with artificial warmth and excessive pride. Your contacts are completely correct. Elite Events handles only the finest occasions. When and where would your principal like to meet to discuss the budget and creative vision? The assistant responded smoothly, following the script perfectly. Excellent. My principal prefers absolute privacy and discretion. There is an exclusive high-end restaurant in the elite district of town. I will text you the address and the reservation details immediately. He would like to meet you there in person this evening at exactly 7 o'clock to sign the contract and transfer the initial retainer fee. Cheetah didn't hesitate for a single second. I will be there personally, with all the necessary contracts. Please inform your boss that he is in the most capable hands, she said proudly before hanging up. She leaned back in her chair, laughing quietly to herself, celebrating what she believed was yet another massive financial victory, completely oblivious to the fact that the shadow of her past was closing in on her. That evening, as the clock struck 7, the atmosphere inside the designated restaurant was remarkably calm, sophisticated, and carefully arranged. Soft, ambient jazz music drifted through the air, and the dim, warm lighting gave the establishment a sense of unshakable privacy. Cheetah arrived wearing an incredibly expensive, glittering designer dress, carrying a premium leather briefcase filled with contract templates, her posture radiating an insufferable aura of arrogance and unearned wealth. She walked through the dining room like a queen, entering her court, her eyes searching for the wealthy international client. A sharp-dressed man in an immaculate corporate suit, Okon's executive assistant, stood up from a secluded VIP table in the corner and signaled to her. "Good evening, ma'am. You must be Cheetah," he said with a polite, empty smile. "Good evening." "Yes, I am." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Cheetah replied pompously as she took her seat across from him, immediately placing her luxury briefcase on the table. "My principal is an incredibly busy man, but he is exceptionally interested in your services. He will be joining us shortly to personally finalize the details," the assistant said, signaling the waiter to bring over an expensive bottle of champagne. Cheetah smiled, entirely consumed by her own vanity, talking at length about her high society connections, her expensive lifestyle, and how her agency catered only to the wealthiest individuals in the country. She gloated about her business acumen, completely blind to the profound injustice of her words. After about 10 minutes of listening to her arrogant self-praise, the assistant's phone buzzed with a text message. He looked at the screen, stood up gracefully, and bowed slightly. "Excuse me for just a brief moment, ma'am. That is my principal arriving at the venue. I will go and guide him to our table. Please enjoy the wine." Cheetah nodded dismissively. "Of course, take your time." Cheetah sat alone at the lavish table, swirling her champagne glass, her mind already spending the millions she anticipated making from this contract. A few seconds passed in silence. Then she felt a sudden heavy presence manifest directly behind her chair. The air in the restaurant suddenly seemed to drop in temperature, turning freezing cold. A voice spoke from the shadows, a deep, resonant, and utterly terrifying voice that she hadn't heard in person for 12 long years. "Good evening, Cheetah." The champagne glass instantly froze in her hand. Her body stiffened, her muscles locking in pure, unadulterated terror as that familiar voice cut through her arrogance like a razor blade. Slowly, as if her neck were made of rusting iron, she turned her head. Her eyes met his Okon. He stood there, tall, imposing, framed by the dim light of the restaurant, looking down at her with a face that was completely devoid of human warmth, his eyes resembling chips of solid ice. Cheetah's heart began to beat with a wild, frantic rhythm, the color draining from her face instantly. "Brother," she stammered, her voice low, trembling, and entirely unsure. Okon didn't say a word at first. He simply pulled out the heavy chair across from her and sat down with a slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm demeanor. "Yes, Cheetah, it's your brother," he said, his voice holding the weight of a judge delivering a death sentence. Cheetah looked around the restaurant frantically, her mind desperately trying to connect the dots. And then the horrific reality suddenly hit her like a physical blow. There was no international client. There was no multi-million naira corporate gala. The executive assistant, the phone call, the meeting, it was all a brilliant calculated setup designed to lure her out of her fortress of lies. Okon leaned slightly forward, his powerful hands resting flat on the table, a stark contrast to her trembling frame. You refused to answer my phone calls for weeks, Cheetah. You left my messages unread, he said, his voice dangerously soft, yet vibrating with controlled rage. Cheetah swallowed hard, her throat incredibly dry, her mind racing to construct a plausible defense. I have been incredibly busy running my agency, brother. The network in Owerri has been terrible, and my corporate schedule. Okon didn't let her finish. He raised a single hand, a sharp, absolute gesture that cut her off instantly. Don't dare, he said firmly, his voice cutting through her words like steel. Do not dare lie to me anymore. Cheetah swallowed again, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized her usual excuses held absolutely no power here. Okon slowly reached into his suit pocket and brought out his smartphone. I want you to listen to something very carefully, Cheetah. I want you to hear the precise words you used to poison our family, he said. He pressed a button on the screen and placed the device face up on the table between them. A digital recording began to play, and the sound of Cheetah's own voice filled the small space around the table. Don't worry, brother. Mother is doing absolutely fine. I just visited her at her house not long ago, and she looks healthier than ever. She also sends her warmest regards and is always praying for your business abroad. Cheetah's eyes widened in absolute horror as the recording played, her past deceptions echoing back to accuse her. She looked at him, her lips parting but no sound coming out. Okon did not look away, his icy glare boring directly into her soul. I have dozens of these recordings, Cheetah, saved over the last 9 years. Every single month you spun the exact same web of deceit, he said as the recording stopped, plunging the table back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Okon's voice became heavier, thick with a profound emotional sorrow mixed with unyielding anger. You always assured me that our mother was living like a queen in the modern house I sent you money to build. But guess who I found sitting on the cold, dirty roadside weeks ago, Cheetah? Guess who I found holding a chipped plastic bowl, begging strangers for a single piece of bread just to survive the night? Cheetah's hands began to shake violently, her designer purse slipping from her lap. Our mother, Okon continued, his voice cracking with the immense pain of the memory. She was on the street, hungry, weak, skeletal, completely alone, wearing nothing but rags, while you were building this empire of greed. Tears of panic and exposure finally gathered in Cheetah's eyes, running down her expensive makeup. I have been sending millions of naira every single month, Cheetah. For years I labored day and night abroad, sacrificing my own comfort, never missing a single transfer, trusting my younger sister completely, Okon said, leaning closer until she could see the raw fury in his eyes. So tell me, Cheetah, where did the money go? Where is the house? Where is our mother's life? I didn't mean for things to get like this, brother. I swear it wasn't my intention, Cheetah stammered, her voice breaking as she shrunk back into her chair, the true face of the villain finally exposed under the harsh light of truth. Okon's eyes stayed fixed on her, entirely unmoved by her sudden tears. But it did get like this, Cheetah. You made sure of it, he replied coldly. She shook her head slowly, weeping now, her mind desperately grasping at straws. I can explain everything. Please, just let me explain what happened, she pleaded in a low, broken voice. Okon looked at her, his face an unreadable block of solid stone. Then start explaining right now, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet restaurant like a harsh command. The room went completely quiet again, the emotional tension building to an unbearable peak as the viewer eagerly awaits how the villain will attempt to justify the ultimate act of cruelty. The elegant atmosphere of the restaurant suddenly felt like an execution chamber to Cheetah. Her lips trembled violently as Okon's piercing, icy gaze ripped away the last remnants of her carefully constructed composure. For a long, suffocating moment, no words could escape her throat. She looked down at the expensive designer contracts scattered on the table, the very documents she had brought to secure her next fraudulent windfall, and realized they were completely useless. Okon watched her with a terrifying clinical precision, his eyes tracking every nervous twitch, his face set with a cold, controlled anger that promised no mercy. Cheetah, talk to me, he said, his voice sharp and heavy, cutting through the ambient music of the restaurant like a blade. Large, heavy tears began to slip down her face, ruining her premium makeup, smudging the illusion of the high society woman she had tried so desperately to become. "It's not as simple as you think, brother," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her exposure. Okon leaned back slightly, his expression completely unyielding. "Then help me understand. Help me understand how a sister could leave her own mother to die in the gutter while stealing millions." Cheetah drew in a deep, ragged breath, desperately trying to steady her shaking hands. She knew the truth was out, but she still hoped to manipulate her brother's emotions, to cast herself as a victim rather than the architect of this monstrous crime. "My husband," she began, pausing dramatically as if the very mention of his name was a physical burden. Okon did not interrupt. He merely watched her with an unblinking, predatory focus. "At the beginning of our marriage, everything was fine," she continued quietly, her voice dripping with calculated sorrow. "He was kind, patient, responsible. I believed I had made the right choice, that he was the man who would help me build a future." She gave a faint, broken smile, a pathetic attempt to look vulnerable. "But after some years, things started to change. Not suddenly, just little by little, until I didn't recognize him anymore." Okon's gaze remained fixed on her, entirely empty of the sympathy she was searching for. "He began to take an absolute obsessive interest in everything I did," she said, wiping her face with a trembling hand. "How I spent money, who I spoke to, even the smallest daily decisions. At first, I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe it was just a husband's concern, a protective nature. But it didn't stop there." Her voice dropped to a dramatic whisper, hoping to draw him in. "He started insisting that as my husband, he should be the one handling all the money that comes into our household, every single naira." Okon's expression hardened slightly, a subtle tightening of his jaw, but he remained completely silent, letting her weave her narrative. "When you started sending those massive amounts of money from abroad," Cheetah continued, her eyes locked on her hands, "he would ask about it constantly. At first, he only wanted to know how much it was. Then he began to demand direct access to the bank accounts. I resisted in the beginning, brother. I swear I did. I told him it was meant entirely for my mother. I told him it was your sweat, your hard work, your sacrifice from abroad." She shook her head slowly, a sob escaping her lips. But he didn't see it that way. A quiet pause settled between them, the tension stretching like a piano wire. He would say things like, "Everything that comes into this house belongs to this house." He told me that a wife has no right to keep financial secrets from her husband. Okon exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening to the point of pain, but his mind was far ahead of her excuses. Cheta continued, her voice becoming increasingly unsteady, a desperate performance of helplessness. "Over time, he gained complete access to my phone, my bank apps, everything. He literally stopped me from going to the bank to access my own accounts. I completely lost control over my money, brother. The money you sent for mother, the money you sent for the grand house," she said, her voice breaking into a theatrical wail. "He took it all. He used it for his own plans, his own business needs, investments I could never question. I lived in absolute fear every single day." She looked up at Okon, searching his eyes for even a glimmer of brotherly affection. "He would always remind me that if I went against him, if I exposed anything to you, he would immediately end the marriage, ruin my reputation, and he would take the children away with him where I would never see them again." Okon's expression changed. Odd. But it was not the change Cheetah was praying for. It wasn't pity. It was a cold, sharp realization of just how deeply rotten the entire situation had become. "I didn't know what to do," Cheetah pleaded, her hands reaching across the table, though she didn't dare touch his suit. "I kept thinking maybe I could fix things quietly. Maybe if his business succeeded, I could replace the money and save mother. I thought it would get better. But it never did." Tears streamed down her cheeks without restraint, a pathetic display from a woman who had just been boasting about her high society status minutes earlier. And the more time passed, the worse everything became. "I knew what was happening to mother was wrong. I knew it every single day, brother. But I was already trapped in a prison of his making." She pressed her lips together, her shoulders dropping in complete humiliating defeat. "I could not tell you because I knew you would confront him, and if you did, it would have destroyed everything. My marriage, my children's home, my entire life, everything would have fallen apart. So I kept quiet, even when I shouldn't have." She collapsed into a fit of weeping, burying her face in her hands. "It is all my fault. I am so sorry, brother. I was too afraid to walk away from a man who was slowly destroying our family." The words hung heavily in the air, the silence inside the VIP booth expanding until it felt crushing. Cheetah wept quietly, believing that her elaborate story of marital victimhood had successfully shifted the blame, or at least softened Okon's wrath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Okon leaned back slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took everything in. The anger that had filled him earlier was no longer just a raw emotion. It had hardened into a sharp clinical instrument of justice. He looked at his sister, really looked at her, noting the expensive diamond earrings she wore, the premium fabric of her dress, and the luxury car keys resting near her briefcase. He thought about the spreadsheets his investigators had given him, which showed she was the sole signatory on all the business accounts for Elite Events Management. Her story of complete, helpless captivity simply did not align with the arrogant, powerful CEO who had walked into the restaurant just minutes ago. The situation was no longer a simple betrayal. It was a deeply layered web of narcissism and greed, and Okon was about to dismantle it completely. Moments later, Okon stood up slowly, towering over her trembling form. His face was an unreadable mask, entirely devoid of the emotion she had tried so hard to provoke. "Come with me," he said quietly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument or hesitation. "I want you to see our mother right now." Cheetah hesitated for a brief, terrified second, her heart freezing at the thought of facing the woman she had abandoned, but looking up at Okon's imposing figure, she knew she had no choice. "All right," she whispered, wiping her face hastily. They left the restaurant together, the executive assistant following at a respectful distance, and got into the back of the waiting luxury SUV. The journey through the darkened streets of Owerri was agonizingly quiet. There was no music, no conversation, only a suffocating, heavy silence between them. Cheetah stared out the window, her mind frantically trying to figure out how to maintain her lie, while Okon sat perfectly still, a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. After a short drive, the car pulled into the driveway of the exclusive, high-security luxury service apartment complex where Okon had hidden their mother. Okon got down first, his movements deliberate and commanding, and led the way inside. Cheetah followed behind him slowly, her expensive heels clicking nervously on the marble floors, her knees shaking with a profound sense of impending doom. They walked through the pristine, quiet lobby and took the private elevator. Neither of them spoke a single word. When they reached the door of the penthouse apartment, Okon paused, his hand resting on the gold handle. He turned it gently and pushed the door open, revealing the luxurious, peaceful sanctuary inside. Inside the bedroom, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, Mrs. Madara was resting quietly on a plush, velvet-covered bed. For a second, Cheetah just stood frozen at the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply looked at the woman she had left to rot on the concrete pavement. Seeing her mother clean, dressed in beautiful fabrics and surrounded by luxury, the very luxury Cheetah had stolen from her, something inside Cheetah's arrogant soul completely shattered. The reality of her exposure, the absolute humiliation of her crimes, crashed down upon her. "Mother," she whispered, her voice cracking completely. Before anyone could say another word, Cheetah rushed forward, her expensive designer dress dragging on the floor, and dropped heavily to her knees beside the bed. Tears flowed instantly, a frantic, panic torrent as she grabbed her mother's frail hand, kissing it repeatedly. "Mother, forgive me, please, forgive me, I am so sorry, Mrs." Madara opened her eyes fully, startled by the sudden dramatic intrusion into her peaceful room. She looked down at the weeping woman at her bedside, her old eyes clouding with a mixture of confusion, recognition, and deep pain. "Cheetah," she said slowly, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of the scene. Cheetah shook her head repeatedly, her chest heaving as she wept hysterically, completely unmasked. "I'm sorry, Mother. I failed you. I failed you completely," she wailed, burying her face in the bedsheets. Mrs. Madara sat up a little, her maternal instincts momentarily softening her expression despite the years of neglect. "Calm yourself, my child," she said gently, her voice a soothing contrast to Cheetah's panic. "Breathe first. Tell me what is happening." But Cheetah could not calm down. The pressure of Okon's silent presence at the back of the room was terrifying. Desperate to validate the lie she had spun in the restaurant, Cheetah began to repeat her explanations through her heavy tears, her voice amplified by panic. She spoke hysterically about how her husband had become a monster, how he had completely controlled her bank accounts, how he had threatened to dissolve the marriage and take her beloved children away if she ever dared to buy food for her mother. She wept about how he had forced them to move away from their old house so no one could trace the stolen funds, and how he had been physically abusive toward her, leaving her broken emotionally and physically. In a final, desperate bid to escape Okon's impending wrath and retain her mother's sympathy, Cheetah reached around to pull down the collar of her designer dress, exposing her back and arms. "Look, Mother! Look at what he did to me! Look at the marks! I was a prisoner in my own home. I wanted to help you, but he wouldn't let me," she cried, pointing to faint old blemishes, trying to pass them off as recent signs of a horrific mess of prison. A heavy, suffocating silence followed her dramatic performance. Cheetah stayed on her knees, panting, waiting for her mother to wrap her arms around her, waiting for Okon to step forward and direct his corporate wrath toward her husband instead of her. But the comfort she expected never came. Okon, who had been standing a few steps away with his arms crossed, exhaled a slow, cold breath that sounded like a winter wind. His face was a mask of utter contempt. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like a pathetic insect that had finally been caught in its own web. "Mrs. Madara closed her eyes briefly, a profound, agonizing sadness washing over her face as she listened to her daughter's desperate excuses. When she opened them again, there was no blindness left in her gaze. She looked at Cheetah's expensive jewelry, her perfectly manicured nails, and the absolute luxury of the dress she wore, things that a true, desperate prisoner of abuse could never maintain while letting her mother starve. "My child," Mrs. Madara said quietly, her voice steady and filled with a devastating clarity. "What you are saying is deeply painful, but do not think your mother is completely foolish." Cheetah's breath hitched, her weeping freezing in her throat. Okon finally stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long dark shadow over his sister. "Enough," he said. The word was delivered firmly, without a single drop of anger, but with an absolute terrifying authority that made Cheetah shrink to the floor. Both women turned to look at him. Okon took a slow breath, his voice dropping into a register of cold steel as he looked down at Cheetah's exposed, trembling form. "I need you to understand something very clearly, Cheetah," he said, his eyes boring into her very soul. "What you have done is completely unacceptable. The story you just told, it is a masterclass in manipulation, but it ends tonight." He paused, letting the silence heavy in the room before continuing. "The only part of your story that is true is that you chose to protect your own selfish interests at the expense of our mother's life. You talk about an abusive marriage, you talk about fear, but my investigators have already spent the last 2 weeks pulling apart your life. They have the bank statements, Cheetah. They have the corporate registration documents for Elite Events Management. Your name, and your name alone, is listed as the sole owner and chief financial officer. Your husband has no legal access to those accounts. Every single wire transfer I sent from abroad was signed off by your digital signature, and the funds were moved directly into your business expansion, not his." Cheetah's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic, the realization that her financial secrets were completely exposed striking her like lightning. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another excuse, but Okon cut her off with a look of pure disgust. "Who told you it was a good idea to stay in a lie? You allowed our mother to suffer, to sit on the concrete roadside begging for crumbs, while you used her life savings to buy diamond earrings and build a corporate reputation. You allowed her to waste away while trying to protect an illusion of success that you were already losing to your own greed." He stepped even closer, his voice vibrating with the sheer weight of the climax. "When I saw Mother on that roadside, Cheetah, my heart broke into pieces. I still cannot erase that horrific image from my mind. A son who sent a fortune, and a mother who received nothing but neglect. And now, standing here, listening to your pathetic lies, I finally understand the true depth of the wickedness we are dealing with. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't fear. It was pure, unadulterated greed." Cheetah fell back onto her heels, her face pale, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps as her entire world collapsed around her. She was completely unmasked, stripped of her arrogance, exposed in front of the mother she had betrayed, and the brother who held her entire future in his hands. There were no more excuses left to make. The triumph of justice was absolute, and the trap had closed completely around the villain. The next morning, the wheels of justice and cosmic karma began to grind with absolute terrifying precision. Mr. Okon did not waste another second, giving his sister opportunities to spin further deceptions or escape her impending fate. Armed with the exhaustive stack of financial records, the forensic accounting spreadsheets, and Cheetah's own recorded audio admissions, he went straight to the federal authorities and corporate law enforcement division in Owerri. After a formal, rigorous review of the overwhelming evidence, The police immediately opened an aggressive, wide-ranging investigation into allegations of domestic violence, psychological intimidation, grand theft, corporate fraud, and unauthorized access to financial instruments. The shockwave of the investigation hit Cheetah's life like a devastating earthquake. Later that very free afternoon, while she was attempting to host a high-profile corporate networking event at her upscale agency, multiple law enforcement officers walked right through the glass doors. In front of her prestigious clients, her staff, and the local media she had invited to boost her reputation, Cheetah was placed in handcuffs. The illusion of the sophisticated, self-made elite woman vanished in an instant as she was led out of the building in absolute humiliation, her frantic screams for mercy echoing down the corporate corridor. Her husband, who was quickly discovered to be an active accomplice in the coercion and the masking of the stolen funds, was also intercepted and taken into custody for intensive questioning. Following a swift investigation and highly publicized court proceedings, the triumph of justice was complete and uncompromising. The judge, looking at the skeletal photographs of Mrs. Madara on the roadside contrasted with the multi-million naira financial ledgers of Cheetah's event agency, delivered a scathing, emotional ruling. Both Cheetah and her husband were found guilty and convicted on multiple serious counts, including domestic violence, grand larceny, theft of funds belonging to family maternal support, corporate fraud, and malicious financial abuse through the misappropriation of entrusted money. The court sentenced them both to lengthy, hard labor prison terms without the option of a fine alongside strict restitution orders that legally seized every single asset under Cheetah's name. The luxurious cars were towed, the bank accounts were drained by court order, and elite events management was permanently liquidated, its assets sold at a public auction to repay the stolen funds. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, there was no celebration inside the family, only a deep, profound silence. But this time, it was a completely different kind of silence. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence born from fear, manipulation, and systematic starvation. It was the peaceful, cleansing silence of healing, where the truth had finally set everyone free. For Cheetah, her imprisonment marked the definitive, brutal end of her years of greed and captivity to vanity. For Okon, it was the heavy burden of familial justice finally carried through to a righteous completion, and for Mrs. Madara, it was the first real, unshakable sense of safety she had felt in over a decade. In the days and weeks that followed the grand exposure, life began to change for the surviving family, slowly but with absolute certainty. Okon did not return to his life abroad immediately. His priorities had permanently shifted. Using a fraction of his vast empire's wealth, he purchased a magnificent, sun-drenched new estate in a quiet, ultra-secure residential district of Owerri, a beautiful, comfortable home surrounded by sprawling gardens where his family could finally feel protected from the harsh realities of the world. On the day they officially moved into the estate, Mrs. Madara stood at the massive grand entrance, her hands resting on the polished wooden doors, and looked around the serene environment in stunned silence. Tears filled her eyes once again, but these were no longer the bitter tears of a roadside beggar. They were tears of profound, overwhelming peace. "My son, is this beautiful paradise truly for us?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Okon walked up beside her, wrapping his arm around her now healthy frame, and smiled with a deep, soulful warmth. "Yes, mother, this is our home now. You will never have to look back at the past again." Cheetah's young children, whom Okon had legally taken custody of to shield them from their parents' disgrace, ran through the hallways, their joyful laughter bringing life back into the family. Okon offered to fully sponsor his nephew and niece's education at the most prestigious international institutions, ensuring the cycle of greed stopped with their generation. Peace returned to their lives, real, radiant peace. They ate gourmet meals together, talked into the late hours of the night, and shared simple, quiet moments that now meant absolutely everything to them. This powerful, emotional journey serves as a severe, unshakable reminder to every single one of us watching today that blind trust can cause unimaginable, catastrophic harm. We live in a world where appearances can be deeply deceiving, and where social inequality can blindside even the most well-meaning individuals. Always, without exception, make sure your loved ones are truly okay. Do not rely entirely on the words of intermediaries, and never allow distance to erase your vigilance. If Okon had questioned the excuses earlier, if he had looked deeper into the structural barriers put up by his sister, He might have discovered his mother's harrowing condition years sooner and saved her from unimaginable torment. Karma is an absolute law. What you sow into the lives of others, especially your own flesh and blood, you will reap 100-fold in destruction. If this story spoke to your heart, if it opened your eyes to the importance of protecting your parents and questioning deceit, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Share your honest opinions, your own family stories, and your reflections on this shocking finale in the comments section below. I will be personally reading through your messages and responding to them. Another powerful, intriguing, and deeply instructive life story is already in production and will be coming your way in just a few days. Make sure you hit that